Hi, welcome to the Personal History Hub. This video today is another civil rights content video, and we're going to be looking at opposition to the civil rights movement. So those people that were not in favour of furthering civil rights in America. So the first group that we're going to look at is the Ku Klux Klan, probably the most famous of these groups, often known as the KKK, and you've probably heard of them before as they're often mentioned in things like music, films, in popular culture in general. So the KKK members identified themselves as being WASPs. So that stands for White Anglo-Saxon Protestants. They saw themselves as being superior to other races, especially African Americans. But they weren't just anti-African American, they were also anti-communist, anti-Jewish, anti-Catholic, and against all foreigners in general. So after the release of a famous 1950 film called Birth of a Nation, they enjoyed a peak membership in the 1920s when they reached 5 million members across America. This, however, did go into decline in the late 20s due to the effects of both the Wall Street crash and a scandal surrounding the Grand Dragon of Indiana, who had brutally raped and mutilated a young girl. However, the Klan would rise again by the 1950s. So Klansmen identified each other by dressing in white sheets and wore white hoods. This outfit was designed to conceal their identities. They often attacked their victims at night time. They had meetings at night time. Their leader was known as the Imperial Wizard. Members of the Klan carried out lynchings or hangings of black people, and they beat up and mutilated anyone that they considered to be their enemy. They stripped some of their victims and put tar on their bodies. They burnt crosses, held rallies, and they terrorized African Americans living in the South. So they were a very, very violent group. Many politicians in the South knew that if they spoke out against the Klan, they would lose votes and then might not be elected to Congress. The power of the Klan was still evident in 1946 when 15,000 people marched to the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. to demand the organisation, the KKK, be made illegal. Lynching was not as common or public as it was in the 1930s, but it did still occur. As the civil rights movement grew in the 50s, so did the terror activities of the Klan. So because of kind of successful things in the civil rights movement, like Brown versus Topeka, for example, the Klan was kind of reacting to things like that, as they obviously did not want civil rights to improve for Black people in America. So this is what the Klan meetings would look like. They're often at night, often in a kind of concealed area, and this is what they would wear. So, white citizens' councils. Following the Brown versus Topeka decision, opposition from white Americans to improve civil rights in the South grew quickly. White citizens' councils were set up to fight the Brown versus Topeka decision, and they campaigned against the NAACP, which had fought strongly in the Brown case. Some councils tried to distance themselves from the violence of the KKK, though some were open to its use. So white citizens' councils were slightly less violent than the KKK and often didn't really do much to conceal their identities because they were trying to oppose things within the law, oppose the NAACP. The councils also tried to prevent African Americans from registering to vote. And they held mass rallies in order to recruit new members and to shape public opinion. They also did play a part in the bus boycott. They tried to stop the boycott by pressuring insurance agencies throughout the South to cancel policies for church-owned vehicles. Also, King was concerned that the activities of the councils would deter white Americans from supporting the African American cause. King accused the councils of being ungodly, unethical, unchristian, and un-American, and could not understand why the federal government did not criticise the councils for their activities. In June 1963, Medgar Evers was killed by a member of a white citizens' council. Medgar Evers was the leader of the Mississippi NAACP, and he was shot dead in Jackson by a white sniper. So, Congress then. Progress towards improved civil rights also met opposition within Congress itself. In 1956, 19 senators and 77 members of the House of Representatives signed something that was called the Southern Manifesto. This document condemned the Brown decision and called it a clear abuse of judicial power. The manifesto also stated the original Constitution does not mention education, neither does any other amendment. The debates clearly show that there was no intent that it should affect the systems of education maintained by the states. The manifesto encouraged states to resist carrying any changes to segregation and stressed that if changes were made by the federal government, then the white public would not accept them and there would be an explosion of hate in the future. However, this was scaremongering from politicians. So the Southern politicians were trying to use the Constitution to support segregation from going through and from happening, and also accuse the federal government of interfering with individual states' running of education. Southern state legislatures continued to pass laws and resolutions aimed at preventing the Brown decision. And in 1956, the Virginia state legislature passed one resistance measure that cut off all state aid to desegregated schools, which obviously left schools with not much choice. Despite opposition in Congress to change civil rights, two civil rights acts were passed in 1957 and 1960, mentioned in the previous video. Both acts were introduced to protect the voting rights of American citizens and led to the Voting Rights Act in 1965. So, who were the Dixiecrats? The term Dixiecrat eventually became used to describe white Southern Democrats, those in the Democrat Party who were white and operating in the South, who opposed civil rights legislation. The issue of civil rights has split the Democrats in the 1948 presidential election. Truman was acutely aware of the racial tensions within the USA, but he knew that he would have to tread very carefully because of these so-called Dixiecrats, these Southern Democrat Party politicians, who would vote against any of his reforming measures. He wanted to introduce a civil rights bill and also put forward an anti-lynching bill, but both were rejected by these Southern Democrats known as the Dixiecrats. They even formed their own political party and won more than 1 million votes in the 1948 presidential election. The Dixiecrats wanted to continue segregation and did not want any interference from the federal government when decisions about race had to be made. In the 1950s, although the Dixiecrats did not continue as a party, they continued to oppose changes in civil rights. So they were still operating in the Democrat Party but opposing changes to civil rights. In 1957, Senator Thurmond of South Carolina, who was a Dixiecrat, conducted the longest ever filibuster. So a filibuster is a tactic used by politicians in debate to stop a bill from being voted on. So there is a time limit on how long most bills can be debated. So the most usual filibuster tactic is to just keep on talking, keep talking rubbish until the deadline for the bill to be passed is reached. So Senator Thurmond's lasted 24 hours and 18 minutes non-stop in an attempt to prevent the passage of the Civil Rights Bill. Many Dixiecrats also joined white citizens' councils in order to continue their struggle. Some even left the Democrat Party and joined the Republicans. In the 1960 presidential election, John Kennedy had to be very careful not to upset the Dixiecrats, he was a Democrat himself, and their supporters for fear of losing their votes. He did this by keeping the issue of civil rights low on his agenda and focusing more on discussing foreign affairs when he was campaigning for president. So the Dixiecrats did also use in the 48 election the Confederate flag. Thanks, don't forget to subscribe to the Pre-Snow History Hub. The next video is going to be on the murder of Emmett Till.